My wife's alpha boss tried to bully me in my house. I made him pay. Have you ever felt like the person you trust the most is hiding something from you? What would you do if you found undeniable proof? This is my story, a story of betrayal, deception, and ultimate revenge. But trust me, the way it all ends, you won't see it coming. Stay with me, and you'll understand why no lie can ever stay hidden forever. I always thought of myself as a grounded guy, logical, steady, the type who didn't get rattled by much. I'm a software engineer, after all. I deal in patterns, processes, making sense of chaos. If something doesn't add up, you troubleshoot, you isolate the problem, you fix it. That's how I've always approached my life, methodically, rationally. And for the better part of 12 years, that approach worked just fine. Natalie and I met when I was in my late 20s. She was a whirlwind, smart, driven, effortlessly charming. We fell into step with each other so easily that it almost felt inevitable, like we were meant to be. Over the years, we built a life together, a modest house in a quiet neighborhood. Steady jobs, shared routines. I'd never say it was perfect, but it was solid. We had a foundation. But lately, that foundation felt shaky in ways I couldn't explain. It started with the small stuff, the things you'd normally brush off. Natalie started working longer hours, which made sense given her promotion to marketing director at a major firm downtown. She had responsibilities, a demanding boss, high-profile clients. I told myself it was normal. I told myself she was just busy. But even busy people still come home, still check in. And she wasn't checking in, not really. Our evenings used to be ours. After work, we'd eat dinner together, watch something mindless on TV, unwind. Now, more often than not, she'd stay late at the office or come home just long enough to eat before retreating into her office to finish up a few things. I didn't complain, not at first. I figured it was temporary, just a busy season. But that busy season never ended. And then there were the little shifts that seemed harmless on the surface but didn't sit right. The phone, for instance. Natalie always used to leave it lying around. We both did. But one day, she started putting it face down. No big deal, right? Except she never did that before. And when I asked her about it, just a casual, offhand question, she shrugged it off. Said it was so she wouldn't see the constant notifications from work. I believed her because I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that everything was still fine, that she was just under a lot of pressure. But then I started noticing other things. She'd be on her phone more than usual, texting late into the evening, smiling faintly at whatever was on the screen. If I walked into the room, she'd angle it away, just a subtle movement, as if she thought I wouldn't notice. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was overthinking things. But once the seed of doubt is planted, it's hard to ignore. Then there were the work dinners that seemed to pop up more frequently. At first, it was one every few weeks. Then it became once a week, sometimes twice. She'd come home smelling different, not like her usual floral perfume but something muskier, heavier. I tried to convince myself it was just the cologne of one of her colleagues, lingering from a crowded restaurant. But deep down, it didn't feel right. And it wasn't just her schedule that changed, it was her demeanor. Natalie had always been warm, affectionate. Even when she was stressed, she'd find a moment to pull me into a hug, to kiss me on the cheek and tell me she loved me. Those moments became rare, then non-existent. When I kissed her, it felt rushed, almost obligatory. When I reached out to hold her hand, she'd pull away, claiming she was distracted or tired. I stopped asking questions because I didn't like the answers I was getting, the excuses that sounded too polished, too rehearsed. It was easier to stay quiet and pretend everything was fine. But I knew it wasn't. Not really. What really got under my skin was the way she started talking about her boss, Adrian Wells. I'd never met him, but I'd heard enough to paint a picture. He was in his late 40s, a seasoned CEO known for his charisma and his cutthroat approach to business. Natalie described him as a visionary, someone who could inspire a room with a single speech. I wanted to be proud of her for working so closely with someone so successful. But there was something about the way she said his name that made my stomach tighten. She'd light up just a little too much when recounting a conversation with him, smile a little too long when mentioning his latest idea. I tried to ignore it. I told myself she just admired him professionally, that it was normal to respect a boss who's good at what they do. But the way she talked about him wasn't just respect. It was something else. And as much as I tried to rationalize it, as much as I wanted to stay logical, my gut told me something wasn't right. Our routine fell apart piece by piece. Date nights became a thing of the past. We used to make an effort to set aside time for just us, dinner at our favorite restaurant, a movie we'd been meaning to see. Those nights disappeared. When I suggested we plan something, she always had an excuse. Too tired. Too busy. Maybe next week. But next week never came. Even when we were home together, we felt miles apart. She'd bury herself in her laptop or her phone while I sat alone on the couch, pretending to watch a show I didn't care about. I stopped trying to initiate conversations because it felt like I was talking to a stranger. The woman I'd known for over a decade, the woman I'd built a life with, was slipping away, and I didn't know how to stop it. I wanted to believe it was just a phase, that we'd find our way back to each other. But the signs were all there, I just didn't want to see them. I kept telling myself I was being paranoid. That it was stress, plain and simple. That everyone goes through rough patches in a marriage. And for a while, I managed to convince myself that was true. But deep down, I knew better. Patterns don't lie. And the pattern of our lives had shifted in a way I couldn't ignore. The little things piled up: the guarded phone, the late nights, the change in her scent, the way she talked about Adrian Wells. Each one on its own could be explained away. Together, they formed a picture I didn't want to look at. But I couldn't look away. Something was wrong. Something was very, very wrong. It was one of those cold, late nights when the air feels heavier than usual, pressing against your chest like an unwelcome reminder that something is off. I was sitting in the living room, absently flipping through channels on the TV, pretending to care about some old sitcom rerun. In reality, I wasn't watching anything. My thoughts were locked on Natalie, on the fact that she still wasn't home. She'd sent a quick text around 7, saying she'd be late because of another work dinner. But now it was almost midnight, and I hadn't heard a word since. My eyes kept flicking to the clock, then to her usual spot on the couch, now empty. It used to be our spot. We'd sit there together, her legs draped over mine as we laughed at dumb shows, shared inside jokes, or just relaxed in each other's company. But lately, that spot had been vacant more nights than not. Tonight, it felt like a black hole, swallowing any sense of normalcy that remained in our house. I tried to brush it off. She'd probably just lost track of time. Maybe they were having another long discussion about that new client. Maybe she ran into traffic on the way home. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself, my gut wouldn't let it go. Something about this didn't feel right. It hadn't felt right for weeks. I knew the signs were there, even if I didn't want to see them. Her guarded behavior, the constant phone calls she'd step outside to take, the way she started avoiding eye contact when I asked how her day went. I could hear the hesitation in her voice when she answered, like she was trying to craft a story on the spot. And then there was Adrian Wells, her boss, the man whose name had become a bitter taste in my mouth. Every time she mentioned him, it felt like a small, sharp needle pricking at the back of my mind. I hated the way she spoke about him, the way her tone softened when she said his name, as if he were some kind of goddamn hero. I tried to play it cool, to act like I didn't notice, but the truth is, I noticed everything. That night, as I sat in the darkened room with nothing but the faint glow of the TV, and the quiet hum of the heater, I felt something shift inside me. The doubt I'd been suppressing all this time, pushing down, burying under logic and excuses, was starting to take root. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I thought about the late nights, the way she rushed to grab her phone the moment it buzzed, the excuses that sounded just a little too rehearsed. And then there was that perfume. The first time I noticed it, I'd asked her about it. She laughed it off, said it was just a new sample a coworker had given her. But it wasn't the kind of perfume you'd wear to the office. It was heavier, sultrier. I didn't want to admit it to myself then, but now, sitting there in the quiet, it was hard not to connect the dots. I hated the way it smelled. I hated that it wasn't hers. I hated what it represented. The evidence was stacking up. And even though my logical mind kept telling me to wait, to gather more information, my heart was already screaming what I didn't want to hear. When I heard the sound of her car pulling into the driveway, my stomach twisted into a knot. I stayed where I was, staring blankly at the TV. as she unlocked the front door and stepped inside. She was careful not to make too much noise, like she was trying not to wake me, except I wasn't asleep. I turned my head, watching her from the corner of my eye, as she slipped off her shoes and set her purse down. Her hair was slightly tousled, her blouse wrinkled in a way that didn't match the perfectly polished woman who had left the house that morning. And there it was again, that faint, unfamiliar scent lingering in the air as she walked past me, murmuring a quiet, "Hey." Without meeting my gaze, I mumbled something back, keeping my voice even, calm. I didn't want to start anything tonight. I wasn't ready yet. I needed more proof, more clarity, more time to figure out how to approach this. So I let her go. I let her head upstairs, let her slip into bed while I stayed downstairs, staring at nothing and feeling the weight of what I now couldn't deny. The next morning, as we moved through our usual routine coffee, quick goodbyes before work, I couldn't stop analyzing every detail. The way she kissed me on the cheek felt mechanical, like she was going through the motions. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. She told me she had a busy day ahead, back-to-back meetings and a late presentation. I nodded, pretending to listen, pretending I wasn't counting the hours until she'd be home again. Probably late, probably smelling like someone else. I hated feeling like this. I hated that I was doubting her, that I was scrutinizing her every move. But I couldn't stop. I needed answers. I needed to know what the hell was going on. By the time I got home that evening, the house felt eerily quiet. Natalie had texted around 7 another work dinner, another late night. I paced the living room, my thoughts racing. I couldn't keep living like this. I couldn't keep playing dumb, pretending I didn't notice the cracks in our marriage growing deeper every day. I grabbed my phone, scrolling through the list of private investigators I'd looked up during a restless night a week ago. One name stood out: Grant. He had a reputation for being discreet, thorough. I hesitated for only a moment before dialing his number. When he answered, his voice was calm, professional. I explained the situation as neutrally as I could, though my voice shook more than I wanted it to. Grant didn't judge, didn't ask questions beyond the essentials. He just said he'd get started right away. I hung up, feeling a strange mixture of guilt and relief. Guilt for crossing that line, for taking such a drastic step. Relief because, for the first time in weeks, I felt like I was doing something. The days that followed were a blur of routine and quiet unease. Natalie came home late most nights, her excuses blending together into a pattern that I couldn't unsee. Work, clients, late meetings. The same perfume. The same tired smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I said nothing, biding my time, waiting for Grant's updates. When they came, they hit me like a punch to the gut. He'd found something that confirmed every suspicion I'd been trying to suppress. A photo of Natalie and Adrian leaving a hotel together. A snapshot of them at a restaurant, leaning in close, her hand on his arm, her smile brighter than I'd seen it in months. I stared at the pictures, my stomach churning, my chest tightening with a mix of rage and despair. There it was. The truth I didn't want, staring me in the face. I didn't confront her right away. I didn't know how. I kept telling myself I needed to stay calm, to think this through, to not let my emotions get the best of me. But every time I saw her, every time I heard her voice, it felt like a knife twisting deeper into my chest. The woman I'd loved, the woman I'd built a life with, was lying to me every single day. And she didn't even seem to care. She thought she was getting away with it. She thought I was blind. But I wasn't. I saw everything now. And I knew I couldn't stay silent forever. I would have to confront her eventually. But not yet. Not until I was ready. Not until I had all the pieces in place. So I waited. And while I waited, the doubt turned into something colder. Something harder. It wasn't just pain anymore. It was resolve. I didn't know what I would say when the moment came. I didn't know how she would react. But one thing was certain. Once the truth was out, there would be no going back. Just when I thought I had all the answers, another shocking twist changed everything. What would you do if you discovered the betrayal was even deeper than you imagined? Comment 1. If you think I'll confront them directly, comment 2. If you think there's another bombshell waiting to drop, let me know your guess, because trust me, the truth is even more unbelievable than you think. I couldn't keep pretending anymore. Something had shifted inside me. And now every time I looked at her, every time I watched her glance at her phone, saw her lips twitch in that faint smile she tried to hide, I felt the slow burn of anger start to build. It was no longer the sharp stab of doubt, or the sting of betrayal. No, this was different. This was colder, more calculated. I wanted answers, not just for my own peace of mind, but so I could finally put an end to the silent war raging inside me. I had to know for sure, even if it meant finding something I didn't want to see. So I started paying attention. Real attention. Every little detail: her schedule, her movements, the way her tone changed when she spoke about her boss or that mysterious client dinner that kept her out so late became a piece of the puzzle. I wasn't going to let her keep me in the dark anymore, and as much as I hated to admit it, I was becoming obsessed with piecing everything together. I wasn't proud of it. The man I used to be would never have resorted to this kind of surveillance, but that man was gone. He'd been chipped away, bit by bit, by every lie she told and every excuse she made. And now I was left with someone else, someone who was done waiting around for the truth to fall into his lap. I started by jotting down times. When she left the house, when she came home, when she claimed to be at work versus when her stories didn't quite add up. I'd always been a logical guy, methodical, organized. It's what made me a good software engineer, and now I was applying that same methodical approach to my personal life. The data didn't lie, patterns emerged. Days she stayed late always coincided with meetings Adrian Wells was known to be in. Even weekends weren't immune. Suddenly, there were urgent projects that demanded her attention on a Saturday afternoon. And while she'd leave dressed in her usual professional attire, she'd come home looking different. Her hair tousled, her blouse just slightly out of place. She always had an explanation, always a perfectly rehearsed reason. But even the most practiced liar slips up eventually. I knew I just had to wait. One Friday, I got home early, determined to test one of my theories. I told her I was working late, but instead, I parked a few blocks away from her office, well out of sight. I sat in my truck, tension coiling in my chest as I watched the building from a distance. The city around me carried on as usual, cars passing by, pedestrians bundled up against the cool evening air, streetlights flickering on as dusk settled in. But all I could think about was what might be happening behind those glass doors. The minutes dragged. I checked my watch every few seconds, each tick sounding louder than the last. And then, just before 7, I saw her. She wasn't alone. Adrian was with her, walking out of the building side by side. They weren't holding hands, weren't even standing too close. But there was an ease between them, a familiarity I hadn't seen in our marriage for months. It made my stomach churn. I followed from a distance, careful not to get too close. They walked a few blocks to a small restaurant, a place I recognized from one of her many work dinners. I parked a little way down the street and watched as they sat at a corner table, leaning in close, their conversation animated. It didn't look like two colleagues discussing business. It looked like two people who knew each other intimately. My chest tightened, the knot of anger and heartbreak growing heavier with every passing moment. I wanted to storm in, confront them right there in front of everyone, demand the truth. But I held back. I needed more. Just a few more pieces of the puzzle, and then I'd have all the proof I needed. After they left, I followed again. They didn't return to the office. They didn't go to another meeting. Instead, they went to a hotel. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut as I watched them disappear through the lobby doors. I stayed parked outside for what felt like hours, gripping the steering wheel so tight. My knuckles turned white. Part of me wanted to burst in, catch them in the act, and end it all then and there. But the other part of me, the part that had been quietly collecting data, connecting dots, and building a case, knew I had to play the long game. Bursting in might feel good in the moment, but it wouldn't give me the kind of closure I needed. I needed undeniable proof, something that couldn't be twisted or explained away. When I got home that night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark, replaying everything I'd seen. Her laughter at the restaurant. The way she looked at him, at Adrian, like he was the only man in the world. And then the hotel. My mind kept circling back to that image, the two of them walking through those doors as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I couldn't stop picturing it. Couldn't stop hearing the phantom echoes of their voices in my head. But as much as it hurt, as much as it made my blood boil, I knew I had to stay in control. I wasn't going to let my emotions dictate my next move. I'd been doing that long enough, and it had only left me spinning in circles. Now, I had a plan. The next day, I reached out to Grant, the private investigator I'd been considering. I laid it all out for him, what I'd seen, what I suspected, what I needed. He didn't ask a lot of questions, just said he'd get to work. It felt strange, handing over the reins to someone else, trusting a stranger to dig into my life and uncover the truth. But I was at a point where I didn't see any other option. I couldn't keep doing it on my own, couldn't keep torturing myself with half answers and unanswered questions. If there was more to find, I needed someone who knew how to find it. Over the next few days, I tried to keep my routine as normal as possible. I went to work, came home, made dinner, and tried not to let my suspicions bleed into every conversation I had with Natalie. It wasn't easy. Every time she smiled at me, every time she kissed me goodbye, it felt like a reminder of how far we drifted apart. But I kept my cool. I reminded myself that the truth would come out eventually. It always did. I just had to be patient. For now, I'd keep watching, keep waiting, and let Grant do his job. Because when the moment came when I finally had everything I needed, there'd be no more doubts. No more questions. Only the cold, hard truth. The days that followed felt like living in a pressure cooker. I kept everything bottled up, pretending things were normal even as my mind raced. Natalie didn't seem to notice. She carried on with her usual routine: late nights, vague explanations, that guarded smile she wore when she thought I wasn't paying attention. But I was paying attention. I had been for weeks. And now, thanks to Grant, I had the first concrete proof that something was seriously wrong. The photos he sent me were grainy, taken from a distance, but they were unmistakable. There she was, leaving the office late at night, Adrian right beside her. In one picture, he was holding the door open for her. In another, they were standing close together on the sidewalk, their faces illuminated by the glow of her phone screen. They weren't touching. Not exactly, but their body language said it all. I stared at those images for what felt like hours, trying to reconcile the woman in them with the woman I thought I knew. I told myself I'd wait for more evidence before jumping to conclusions, but the truth was already staring me in the face. Still, I wanted to be sure. I didn't just want to confront her. I wanted the kind of proof that would leave no room for excuses. No way for her to twist the story. So I stayed quiet, biding my time, waiting for Grant's next update. Meanwhile, the first tried to act normal at home, smiling when she came through the door, asking how her day went, pretending I wasn't picturing her with him every time she looked at her phone. It was exhausting. I'd always been good at compartmentalizing, but this was different. Every lie she told, every moment of feigned innocence, felt like a new weight pressing down on me. And yet, I played along. I had to. I needed her to think I didn't know, that I was still the clueless, trusting husband she thought she could deceive. It killed me inside, but I forced myself to keep up the charade. One night, she came home even later than usual. Her excuse was the same as always: another client dinner, a last-minute meeting. She tried to brush past me, heading straight for the bedroom, but I stopped her. "You're working a lot these days," I said, keeping my tone light. "Everything okay at the office?" She paused, her back to me, then turned with a carefully neutral expression. "It's just a busy time of year," she said. "You know how it is." I nodded, not pressing further, even though I knew that wasn't the full truth. The old me would have taken her answer at face value, would have trusted her implicitly. But that part of me was gone. I could feel it. I didn't believe her anymore. Not about her schedule, not about the stress at work, not about anything. As the days turned into weeks, the tension in our house became unbearable. I'd catch her glancing at me when she thought I wasn't looking, a hint of nervousness in her eyes. Maybe she was starting to sense that something had changed, that I wasn't the same man she'd been stringing along. Maybe she was wondering if I knew. The thought gave me a grim sort of satisfaction. Let her wonder. Let her feel even a fraction of the unease I'd been carrying. I started staying up later, waiting for her to come home, just so I could watch her reactions. The way she avoided my gaze, the way her answers felt more rehearsed than ever. It was like she was performing a role, and not very convincingly. The more she tried to act normal, the more obvious it became that something was wrong. And still, I said nothing. I kept my suspicions to myself, even as the evidence piled up in my inbox, courtesy of Grant. More photos, more timestamps, more proof that my wife wasn't where she said she was. One evening, I finally got the call I'd been waiting for. Grant's voice was calm, steady, but what he told me made my blood run cold. "She's with him," he said. They left the office together and checked into the Grand Belmont. My stomach dropped. The Grand Belmont wasn't just a hotel. It was the hotel, the kind of place people go when they don't want anyone to know they were there. The kind of place where discretion costs extra. I sat there, phone in hand, trying to process his words. Part of me wanted to drive straight there, to catch them in the act, to finally confront her. But I didn't move. I couldn't. Instead, I stared out the window at the darkened street, the weight of everything pressing down on me. "What do you want me to do?" Grant asked, his voice cutting through my thoughts. I took a shaky breath. "Nothing," I said. "Just keep documenting everything. I'll handle it from here." When Natalie came home that night, she was quiet, almost subdued. She kissed me on the cheek, the gesture so hollow it made my chest ache. "Long day," she murmured before disappearing into the bedroom. I stood there for a moment, listening to the sound of her footsteps fading down the hall. My hands curled into fists at my sides. I knew where she'd been, I knew who she'd been with. And yet, I hadn't confronted her. Not yet. I was still waiting, still holding out for something, maybe for the right moment. Maybe for more proof, maybe just for the courage to face what I already knew. I stayed up late that night, sitting in the darkened living room, replaying every conversation, every lie, every moment that didn't add up. I thought about the man I used to be, the man who would have trusted her without question. That man was gone now. In his place was someone I didn't recognize, someone colder, angrier, more determined than ever to get to the truth. As the days blurred together, I began to feel like I was living in a surreal, almost out-of-body experience. I'd go through the motions, work, errands, pretending everything was fine while my mind churned nonstop. Every smile from Natalie, every casual remark, every seemingly innocent question she asked, only deepened my suspicion. I couldn't help but analyze each word she said, each movement she made, replaying them over and over in my mind. There were moments when I wondered if I was losing it. Maybe I was reading too much into things, letting my imagination run wild. But then I'd think of those photos, of Grant's voice on the phone telling me she was at the Grand Belmont, and the anger would resurface. I wasn't crazy, I wasn't overthinking. She was lying. And every lie she told was another crack in the foundation of our marriage. I found myself retreating into my own little world. At work, I'd stare at my screen for hours, barely registering the lines of code in front of me. At home, I'd disappear into the garage under the pretense of fixing something that didn't need fixing, just so I wouldn't have to sit in the same room as her and pretend everything was normal. I wasn't ready to confront her, not yet. But I also couldn't bring myself to act like the husband she wanted me to be. The disconnect between us had become a canyon, and I wasn't sure it could ever be bridged. Sometimes I caught her looking at me, her expression unreadable. Maybe she sensed that I was pulling away, that I was no longer the man who'd once blindly trusted her. Or maybe she didn't care. Maybe she was so far gone that it didn't even register anymore. Either way, I kept my distance, both physically and emotionally. It was easier that way. Or at least that's what I told myself. One evening, I came home to find her already in the kitchen, cooking dinner. The smell of rosemary and garlic filled the air, a scent that used to make me feel comforted. Now it only made me feel uneasy. She looked up and smiled as I walked in. "You're home early," she said, her tone light, conversational. I nodded, not trusting myself to say much. "Yeah. Slow day at the office." It wasn't true, of course. I'd left early because I couldn't focus, couldn't sit through another pointless meeting while my mind replayed the images of her and Adrian. I just wanted to be home, even if home didn't feel much like home anymore. She turned back to the stove, stirring a pot of sauce. "I thought we could eat together tonight," she said. "It's been a while." I mumbled something non-committal, feeling the tension tighten in my chest. Was she trying to make an effort? Or was this just another act, another way to keep me off balance? I didn't know what to think anymore, but I sat down at the table anyway, watching as she brought over 2 plates and set them down. She sat across from me, her smile faltering slightly when I didn't pick up my fork right away. "Everything okay?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. I nodded, forcing a small smile. "Yeah, just tired." She seemed to accept that, turning her attention to her food. I stared at her for a moment, trying to read her expression. Was she guilty, nervous? Or was she simply playing the part of a devoted wife, hoping I wouldn't notice the cracks in the facade? I wanted to say anything to break the silence, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I picked up my fork and took a bite. The flavors bitter on my tongue despite the effort she'd put into the meal. We ate in near silence, the only sound the clink of silverware against plates. My mind raced, the questions piling up faster than I could process them. Did she really think I didn't know? Did she believe I was that blind? Or was she testing me, waiting to see if I'd confront her? Every moment felt like a delicate balancing act, and I didn't know how much longer I could keep it up. After dinner, she reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. The gesture caught me off guard, and for a split second, I felt a flicker of the old us, the warmth, the connection that used to come so easily. But just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by the crushing weight of doubt. "I know I've been working a lot," she said, softly, her eyes searching mine. "I know it's been hard on us. I just want you to know. I'm trying." Her words hung in the air, and I didn't know how to respond. Was she trying? Or was this another well-crafted excuse, a way to deflect attention from what she was really doing? I nodded slowly, not trusting myself to say much. "I appreciate that." She smiled faintly, her hand lingering on mine for another moment before she stood to clear the dishes. I sat there, staring at the empty plate in front of me, my stomach churning. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that she was trying, that things could go back to the way they were. But the evidence in my inbox told a different story, and I couldn't ignore it. That night, as we lay in bed, I found myself listening to her breathing, steady and even, as if she had no trouble sleeping. I, on the other hand, stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her and Adrian laughing together at the restaurant. Walking into the hotel, their bodies close enough to suggest what was happening behind closed doors. My fists clenched under the covers, the anger bubbling up again. But I didn't say anything, not yet. I had to be sure. I had to be patient. The truth was already out there. I just needed the right moment to bring it to light. Until then, I would wait. I would keep collecting the pieces, keep putting the puzzle together. And when the time came, there would be no denying it. It was late when Grant's call finally came. I'd been staring at my phone, the screen dimmed to a faint glow in the otherwise dark room, the air so still I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator down the hall. I answered on the first ring. "Yeah?" My voice was quieter than I'd intended, almost as if I didn't want to disturb the silence in the house. Grant didn't waste any time. "She's at the Belmont again," he said, his tone as steady and matter-of-fact as ever. My chest tightened, the words hitting me like a punch I'd been bracing for, but still couldn't quite absorb. "She and Wells checked in together about 20 minutes ago," Grant continued. "I've got photos." My fingers gripped the phone tighter. "Send them," I said flatly. I hung up before he could respond. The pictures came through moments later, and even though I'd already seen similar images, even though I knew what to expect, my stomach still churned. There she was, my wife, walking through the glass doors of the Grand Belmont Hotel, Adrian Wells beside her. He was holding a leather briefcase in one hand, his other hand grazing her lower back as they stepped inside. She was smiling. Smiling, the sight of it made me feel sick. I swiped through the images, my pulse quickening with each one. I didn't need to keep looking. I already knew the truth. But I couldn't help myself. The photos were evidence, proof that I wasn't crazy, that I wasn't imagining the distance between us. The lies. The way her eyes would flick away from mine when I asked about her day. This was real. She was cheating. And not just with anyone with him. The man she always spoke about with a little too much admiration. The man whose name seemed to light her up in a way I hadn't seen in years. I dropped the phone onto the table and pressed my palms into my eyes, trying to steady myself. My thoughts were a tangled mess of anger, betrayal, and disbelief. For a while I just sat there, breathing slowly, trying to calm the storm in my head. But no matter how many times I told myself to stay rational, to think this through logically, my mind kept flashing back to that smile. That goddamn smile. She never smiled at me like that anymore. When was the last time she looked at me with that kind of joy, that kind of ease? I couldn't remember. It felt like another life, like another marriage. And maybe that's exactly what it was. Maybe the marriage I thought I had, the partnership I believed in, had died a long time ago. And I just hadn't realized it until now. I grabbed the phone again and stared at the pictures. She looked happy, comfortable, as if she belonged there, next to him, as if she wasn't hiding anything. It was almost worse than the lies themselves. Seeing how at ease she seemed in another man's presence. It made everything else, the late nights, the evasive answers, the growing distance between us, fall into place. I thought about confronting her right then and there, about calling her, demanding she come home and explain herself. But I didn't. I wasn't ready yet. Confronting her now, in the heat of the moment, wouldn't get me what I wanted. It would only give her the chance to twist the story, to make excuses, to deny everything. No, I needed to be smart about this. I needed to wait until I had everything lined up. When I confronted her, there would be no room for doubt, no room for lies. So I sat back, gripping the edge of the table, my knuckles white, and forced myself to wait. Patience wasn't my strong suit, not when it came to this. But I knew that if I rushed into it, I'd regret it later. Time crawled by as I sat there, the weight of the evidence pressing down on me. My mind raced with possibilities. What was I going to say to her when the time came? How would she react? Would she deny it, even in the face of undeniable proof? Or would she break down and confess everything? I didn't know, and that uncertainty gnawed at me. I glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight. She wouldn't be home for hours, if she came home at all tonight. The thought made my stomach turn. I pushed back from the table and stood, pacing the kitchen. The walls felt too close, the air too thick. I needed to get out, clear my head. Grabbing my jacket, I stepped outside, the cool night air hitting me like a slap. I walked aimlessly through the neighborhood, the sound of my boots on the pavement the only noise in the stillness. The streets were quiet, the houses dark, and for a moment I felt completely untethered, as if I were the only person left in the world. Eventually, I found myself by the park where we used to go on weekends. It was empty now, the swings swaying slightly in the breeze. I stood there, staring at them, remembering how we used to sit on the bench nearby, laughing, talking about nothing and everything. It felt like a lifetime ago. I wanted to feel anger, to let it consume me, but all I felt was hollow. I didn't know how long I stood there, lost in thought. At some point, I turned back and headed home, the night stretching on endlessly. When I walked through the front door, the house was still dark. She wasn't back yet. I sat down on the couch, staring at the blank TV screen, my mind going in circles. I thought about Grant's words, the photos, the undeniable proof I now had. And I thought about that smile. That damn smile. It would haunt me for a long time. But not for much longer. Soon, I'd have to face her. Soon, she'd have to explain. And soon, the lies would finally come to an end. It was finally time. I'd spent weeks piecing everything together, lying in the dark, thinking about all the evidence. Every grainy photo, every text message I'd seen when I turned her phone over, everything pointed to the truth I didn't want to admit, but could no longer deny. This wasn't some fleeting affair, a moment of weakness that she instantly regretted. This was deliberate, calculated. She had looked me in the eyes every day, kissed me on the cheek, said she loved me, and then walked right into his arms without a second thought. I didn't want to believe it, but I couldn't pretend anymore. And the anger, the betrayal that had been simmering inside me, was finally boiling over. The house was quiet when she walked in that evening. The door clicked shut behind her, and she stood in the entryway for a moment, taking off her shoes and hanging her coat. I was already seated at the kitchen table, the manila folder in front of me like a loaded weapon. My heart was pounding, but I forced myself to stay calm. I'd been imagining this moment for days, what I would say, how she might react. Would she deny it? Try to twist the story? Or would she crumble, knowing she'd been caught? She stepped into the kitchen and saw me sitting there. "Hey," she said, her voice light, as if nothing was wrong. "You're home early." I didn't respond right away. I just looked at her, my expression blank. She stopped, her smile faltering. What's wrong? I picked up the folder, sliding it across the table toward her. Why don't you tell me? I said, my voice low, steady. Her brow furrowed as she looked at the folder. What's this? Open it, I said, leaning back in my chair. She hesitated, then slowly reached for it. The tension in the room was suffocating. The silence so heavy I could hear my own breathing. When she flipped the folder open and saw the photos, the receipts, the texts, her face went pale. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. I know, Natalie, I said finally, breaking the silence. I know everything. Her hands trembled as she closed the folder. I can explain. Don't, I cut her off. Don't even try. She looked up at me, her eyes wide, pleading. Jacob, it's not what you think. I slammed my hand on the table, the sound echoing through the room. Stop lying, I shouted. Just, stop. My voice cracked, and I hated how vulnerable it made me sound. But I couldn't hold it in anymore. How long? I asked, my tone quieter now but no less sharp. How long has this been going on? She hesitated, her gaze darting to the folder, then back to me. I don't know, she stammered. Don't know? I repeated, incredulous. You don't know how long you've been sleeping with your boss? It's not, she started, but I cut her off again. I saw the photos, Natalie. The texts. The hotel bills. You think you can stand there and pretend this isn't what it looks like? After everything I've found? My chest felt tight, the words tumbling out in a rush. I trusted you. I loved you. And you just threw it all away like it meant nothing. Tears welled up in her eyes, but I wasn't moved. I couldn't be. Not now. I'm sorry, she whispered. I never wanted to hurt you. You didn't want to hurt me? I said, laughing bitterly. Every single time you lied to my face, you knew what you were doing. Every time you snuck off to meet him, you made a choice. Don't stand there and tell me you didn't want to hurt me. She wiped at her eyes, her voice trembling. It just happened. I didn't mean for it to. Bullshit, I snapped. You don't just happen to have an affair. You don't just happen to check into a hotel with him. You don't just happen to lie to your husband every goddamn day. This wasn't a mistake, Natalie, it was a decision. A deliberate, calculated decision. She broke down then, covering her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking. I'm sorry, she kept saying, over and over. As if those words would magically fix everything. But they didn't. They didn't erase the nights I spent wondering where she was. They didn't undo the lies, the betrayal, the hollow, aching feeling that had taken root inside me. Sorry isn't enough, I said quietly. Not this time. For a long moment, neither of us said anything. The only sound was her quiet sobbing. I wanted to feel something: anger, relief, closure, but all I felt was empty. Hollow. The woman I thought I knew, the life I thought we had, was gone. And there was no going back. I stood up, the chair scraping against the floor, and she flinched. I don't know what happens next, I said, my voice steady again. But I do know these things are going to change. I turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving her standing there, clutching that folder like it was a lifeline. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Because the moment I'd been dreading, the moment I'd spent weeks preparing for, had finally come and gone. And now, all that was left was the wreckage. I knew this confrontation wasn't going to give me the answers I wanted. Nothing she said could change what she'd done. The truth had already been laid bare, and her words felt like empty echoes bouncing off the walls. But even as I walked out of the kitchen, leaving her there with that manila folder, something gnawed at me. It wasn't enough. I'd thought seeing her crumble under the weight of her lies would bring me some kind of satisfaction. But it didn't. It felt hollow. I had all the proof I needed, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that the worst wasn't over. This was just the beginning, and deep down, I knew it. I sat down in the living room, staring at the blank TV screen, my thoughts racing. My hands were still trembling from the confrontation, my pulse a steady, dull throb in my temples. The house felt different now, cold, unwelcoming. I'd built my life here with her. Every corner of this place was filled with memories. But now, all I could see were the shadows. The hidden lies she'd tucked into every inch of our home. I glanced at the framed photo on the mantle, our wedding day. She looked so happy. I remember that day like it was yesterday. The way she held my hand. The way she looked at me like I was the only person in the world. And now? Now I couldn't look at her without seeing him. Without seeing the betrayal written all over her face. I heard her footsteps in the kitchen. Soft and hesitant. She wasn't crying anymore. Maybe she thought I was done. Maybe she thought the confrontation was over. But it wasn't. I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. I stood up, my body tense, and walked back toward the kitchen. She was still there, sitting at the table, the folder now closed and pushed aside. She looked up at me as I entered, her eyes red and swollen. "Jacob," she started, but I raised a hand to stop her. "You don't get to talk," I said, my voice steady but cold. "Not anymore." She flinched, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. "I don't know what you want me to say." "You don't have to say anything," I snapped. "I've seen enough. I know enough." "Then what do you want?" she asked, her voice shaking. "I want to understand," I said, my jaw tight. "I want to know why. Was it something I did? Something I didn't do?" She looked away, her gaze fixed on the floor. "It wasn't about you," she said quietly. "That's not an answer," I shouted, slamming my hand on the table. The sound made her jump, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of fear in her eyes. Good. Let her be afraid. She'd stolen so much from me, my trust, my sense of security, my peace of mind. The least she could do was give me an honest answer. "I gave you everything," I said, my voice rising. "Everything. I worked late so you wouldn't have to. I stood by you when things were hard. I believed in you when you didn't believe in yourself. And this is how you repay me?" "I'm sorry," she whispered, but the words felt empty. I'd heard them too many times. They meant nothing now. "Sorry isn't enough," I said, my voice breaking. "You can't fix this with an apology." She finally looked at me, tears streaming down her face. "I never meant to hurt you." I laughed bitterly. "Never meant to hurt me? Every time you lied, every time you went behind my back, you made a choice. Don't tell me you didn't mean to hurt me. You knew exactly what you were doing." Her lip quivered, but she didn't look away this time. "I don't know what you want me to say," she repeated. "I want you to admit it," I said, my voice firm. "Admit that you destroyed us. That you made this choice. Own it." "I did," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I made a mistake, Jacob. A horrible, awful mistake." "Don't call it a mistake," I spat. "It's not a mistake. A mistake is something you do once. Something you regret immediately. You've been lying to me for months. You don't get to hide behind the word mistake." She wiped at her eyes, her hands shaking. "I was stupid. I let it go too far." "You think?" I said, my tone laced with sarcasm. "Too far? You think checking into hotels with him was just a little too far?" Her head dropped, and she covered her face with her hands. "I don't know what to say." "Then don't say anything," I said, my voice quiet but sharp. "Just sit there and think about what you've done." The room fell silent again, the tension so thick I could feel it in my chest. I stared at her, waiting for something in admission, a real apology, anything that might help me understand. But there was nothing. Just her quiet sobs and my own ragged breathing. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you," I said finally, my voice trembling. "I don't know if I even want to." She looked up at me, her face pale, her eyes wide with desperation. "Jacob, please. I'll do whatever it takes." I shook my head, taking a step back. "It's not that simple. Just tell me what you need," she said, her voice breaking. "Tell me how to fix this." "You can't fix this," I said, my chest tight. "I don't even know if it's possible." She reached out, but I stepped further away. "Jacob, please. I need time," I said, cutting her off. "I need space. I need to figure out if I can even look at you without seeing what you've done." She nodded slowly, her hands dropping to her lap. "I understand." "I don't think you do," I said, my voice hard. "I don't think you understand what you've done to me. To us. But you will. Trust me. You will." With that, I turned and walked out of the kitchen. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay there. Not with her. Not right now. I grabbed my keys off the counter and left the house, the cool night air hitting me like a slap. I needed to clear my head, to breathe, to think. I needed to figure out what came next. Because nothing would ever be the same again. It took weeks, maybe months, before I finally started to feel like I could breathe again. The silence in the house was overwhelming at first. Without Natalie's voice or her footsteps down the hall, every creak of the floorboards, every shift in the wind outside seemed louder, sharper, more unsettling. I'd spent so long wrapped up in anger, betrayal, and doubt that when it was all stripped away, I wasn't sure what to do with myself. But I knew one thing for certain: I couldn't keep living in the past. If I stayed stuck in that endless loop of what-ifs, I'd never find a way forward. I threw myself into work, taking on extra projects, pulling longer hours. The familiar hum of the office computers, the soft murmur of my coworkers talking at their desks, became a welcome distraction. My mind had always been at home in the clean, logical world of code, where everything made sense, where problems could be fixed if you just found the right line to tweak. I told myself that if I could handle the complexity of systems and algorithms, then I could handle this. But even as I buried myself in my work, I couldn't entirely escape the thoughts that crept in during the quiet moments. What was she doing now? Was she sorry? Did she miss me? I hated that I cared. I hated that part of me still wondered if things could have been different. Friends reached out more often than usual, which was both a blessing and a burden. A couple of my old college buddies insisted on dragging me out for drinks, which I reluctantly agreed to. Sitting in a dimly lit bar, nursing a whiskey while they made awkward small talk about sports or politics, was better than being alone with my thoughts. I appreciated their effort, even if they didn't know what to say. Hell, I didn't know what to say. They'd glance at me now and then, as if waiting for me to break down or spill the whole story. But I never did. I kept it vague, just going through some stuff or work's been rough. They nodded, offered another round, and left it at that. It was enough. At home, I started to rebuild in small ways. I cleaned out the garage, something I'd been putting off for years. I tackled the overgrown backyard, pulling weeds until my hands ached, the physical effort grounding me in a way I hadn't felt in months. I rearranged the furniture in the living room, just to make the space feel different. I even cooked a few meals for myself instead of relying on takeout every night. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Each little change, each small step toward reclaiming the house as my own, felt like a quiet victory. One evening, I found myself sitting on the couch, staring at the wedding photo on the mantle. I hadn't taken it down. Not yet. Maybe I wasn't ready to let go completely. The smiles in that picture were so genuine, so full of hope. I wondered if the man in that photo would even recognize me now. Would he understand the choices I'd made, the anger I'd felt, the pain that still lingered, no matter how hard I tried to push it away? I set the photo face down on the shelf, and turned off the light. It felt like the right thing to do, even if it left the room a little darker. Life went on. That's the thing about time, it doesn't wait for you to catch up. It just keeps moving, dragging you along with it whether you're ready or not. I started running in the mornings, something I hadn't done since college. The cold air burned my lungs, the rhythmic pounding of my feet on the pavement drowning out everything else. It gave me clarity, a sense of control. Slowly but surely, I began to feel stronger. Not just physically, but mentally. I was learning how to stand on my own 2 feet again. Then, one day, I got a message. It wasn't from Natalie, it was from Grant. He'd kept tabs on Adrian Wells, even after the fallout. The man had lost everything. His job, his reputation, his carefully curated image of success. Last I heard, he was living in a cramped apartment on the other side of town, a far cry from the luxury condo he used to brag about. I didn't ask Grant to keep me updated, but I wasn't surprised that he did. Thought you'd want to know, the message said. Wells filed for bankruptcy. I stared at the screen for a long moment, then typed back, thanks. That was it. I didn't feel triumph or satisfaction. It was just another piece of information. Another chapter in a story I was no longer interested in reading. Wells was done, Natalie was gone, and I was still here. I won't lie and say everything fell into place overnight. There were still hard days. Nights when I'd wake up in the dark, my chest tight, and have to remind myself to breathe. Moments when I'd catch myself reaching for my phone to send her a text, before remembering that she wasn't on the other end anymore. But those moments became fewer and farther between. Each time, I found it a little easier to let go. Eventually, I took a trip. It was something I'd always talked about but never followed through on. I drove out to the mountains, booked a cabin, and spent a week surrounded by trees and quiet. No phones, no emails, no reminders of the life I'd left behind. I spent my mornings hiking, the crisp air filling my lungs, the sound of leaves crunching underfoot reminding me that I was still alive, still moving forward. In the evenings, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sun dip below the peaks. It wasn't a grand revelation or a life-changing epiphany. It was just peace. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. When I got back home, the house felt different. The shadows didn't seem as long, the silence not as heavy. I took the wedding photo down from the shelf and put it in a box. I didn't throw it away. I wasn't ready for that, but I didn't need to see it every day anymore. It was a part of my past, a reminder of a life that had shaped me, but no longer defined me. Looking back, I don't think there was a single moment when I knew I'd turned a corner. It wasn't one big breakthrough. It was 1,000 small ones. It was learning how to sit with the discomfort, how to face the loneliness without letting it consume me. It was finding new routines, new hobbies, new reasons to get out of bed in the morning. And it was accepting that healing isn't a straight line. There are ups and downs, good days and bad. But as time went on, the good days started to outweigh the bad. Now, when I think of Natalie, it's not with anger or sadness. It's more like neutrality. She's a part of my story, but she's not the whole story. And that's okay. I've made peace with the fact that some questions will never have answers. Why did she do it? Could I have done something differently? Those questions don't keep me up at night anymore. They're just echoes now. Faint reminders of a chapter I've already turned the page on. What I've learned is that rebuilding yourself after something like this isn't about erasing the past. It's about finding a way to carry it with you, without letting it weigh you down. It's about discovering who you are when the dust settles, when the anger fades, and when the people you thought you couldn't live without are no longer there. And maybe, just maybe, it's about realizing that you're stronger than you ever thought you could be. Now you know how the truth came to light, how the lies unraveled, and how I took back control. But was it all worth it? What would you have done in my shoes? I want to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment, and let me know if you think I made the right choice, or if I should have handled it differently. This story might be over, but the conversation has just begun. Life taught me that trust, once broken, can rarely be restored to what it was. I learned that respecting oneself means setting boundaries, and walking away from those who take you for granted. In this fast-moving, results-driven society, it's easy to overlook what truly matters: honesty, loyalty, and personal dignity. No paycheck, no flashy title, and no fleeting romance are worth losing your integrity. If you've been disrespected or wronged, stand up for yourself. Make it clear that your value isn't negotiable. Rebuilding isn't easy, but it's better than staying in a place that eats away at your self-worth.